Thanks so much, everyone. I think this was very, very generative, and I've so much to think about even when the work is over. And some of this ties to some of my own discomfort with the work now, right? As in, some years have passed. I mean, I think and I can see, as we all do, I was rushing to finish the book, and I was like, okay, let this rest for now. But even when you're talking about why am I calling it vernacular all the time, I had the same discomfort while writing it, and I was like, why am I constantly using the term vernacular to just constantly keep qualifying it?
You look like a vernacular.
I do not. By no stretch of imagination. So here, and I was like,
she used to. When she was doing the
and I was feeling like not anxious, but I was feeling upset about it. Like, why is it that constantly I'm having to qualify this? At the same time, I had to, because there was a way in which I was trying to say that this ends up becoming particular, and now this is the discomfort that I have. That I think I have done the same. That I have also ended up saying that rent is different from the global north, right? This rent is different, and I don't think I wanted to say that, right? But at parts, I think it's sort of merging into that kind of a narrative. But I don't think I'm happy with that. So there is particularly that question I've been thinking about, that what is therefore rent, and what does it really mean to say studying rent from whatever location we want to call it, global south, we want to call it local, wherever we want to define it as. I don't think I have a great term. But I also have a deep problem. So I know the work that you're referring to. This is Yanis Varoufakis. This is also Brett Christophers, who now saying that global capital is now rent, from Amazon to Uber to everybody is now rent. And I feel that this is again the same kind of theoretical work that has been passed down from the global north, which universalizes. Right now, everything was capital until now, and suddenly now everything is rent, right? And we have to now say, okay, make peace with it, right? But I still would like to push back on that and say that I think the world is more complex, and complexity is what I think we should all embrace, rather than sort of these kinds of very broad meta theories. And that's where I say that, as in, there is that difficulty, and I think we should refrain from saying, okay, everything is now rent or capital or this. I think there are more forms, there are more shapes, there are more complexity here, and we should sort of refrain from, like, I would not do that. And which is why I constantly, my pushback to theorists of the global north is precisely that stop using these global frames to talk about your own work. Talk about London. I'm happy to hear what's going on in London's real rentier capitalism, but then make it about London, right? And in fact, it's so frustrating sometimes that my book has Delhi in its title. I think your book also has Delhi in its title. When you look at a book from global north, even when they are, say, on Noida, right? They will never mention Noida in the title, right? It's a city, some global city, some finance capital, something. They will never mention the name of the city, because what they want to tell you is that this is this. Only when you open the pages and you see the chapters that you realize that, okay, it's a book on Noida, right? So this kind of distinction is definitely there, and I don't know how to push back, but I definitely feel the urge to push back. So I'm with you on that, and let's conspire more together. Right. So come back to the first question that you started with, that the urban-rural divide for understanding capitalism. I think these are the limits to the. So I was making a case against frameworks, but these were some of the frameworks that I was working with, or at least self-understanding that I was working with, which was that I am a scholar of urban studies, right? So while this urban-rural divide and the nature of capital has been used to talk about urbanisms, right? Now we have subaltern urbanisms and suburbanisms and frontier urbanisms, speculative urbanisms, right? So you have various kinds of terms floating around on different kinds of urbanisms. So we have used the urban-rural divide and influence of capital to talk about the urban space, but I think there is scope to do the reverse, right? That the study of urbanism now should tell us something else about capitalism particularly, right? What does studying urbanism have to tell about the nature of capital or capitalism, right? So here is, I think, when I was midway into the work or almost towards the end, that I realized that there are a lot of questions which are emerging, which I will not be able to answer because my framing was different. My framing was one of city versus the village, village versus the city, right? And as I realized, which I was talking about earlier as well, that when I realized that there is a whole territoriality to it, which I hadn't seen before when I was conceptualizing the work, the way in which Delhi's villages relate to Rajasthan's villages and Haryana's villages and UP's villages, I couldn't have predicted this before, right? Had I known this, or if I was not so, say, tied to my own framework of being an urban studies scholar, had I pitched this as a regional question, right? How do we study political economy of India, right? Or political economy of Northwest India? Then some of these questions that you're asking, which is exactly your work, right? Your work is about this particular region and what is happening to agrarian capitalism. And I think this is also the sad part, as in that as urban studies has really seen an uptake, right? As in a lot of us have taken to urban studies very, very fast and very well, and it's become quite popular. I think it's also met with a similar kind of a decline in interest in rural studies. I think we don't have village studies anymore. That kind of interest is sort of going down. I hope that has changed because I think it's very important to tell the story of what's going on in Indian villages. And I think because while I was doing this work, there was no conversation with what's happening in village studies or rural agrarian capital kind of work. I think this framing has become particular to the city versus the village, Delhi village versus Delhi city kind of framing. So it has limits like that. So so which is why I could see how historical junctures of green revolution could have led to a particular rise of OBCs and in this entire region. So which I try to tell through the story of, as in towards the end, I hint at how Jats of the rural parts of Delhi and even otherwise have very different concerns, and this is what I talk about in the chapter on panchayats, have very different concerns from the Jats of Delhi, right? Even when this you could see, as in this is when I was wrapping up my work, the farmers' protest had already begun. You see the entire Delhi border being now, which put a fracture between these two sides of the community, right? So there were Delhi Jats who were now very much within the BJP framework. They are very much invested in the current regime, and they were the ones who were opposed by the farmers who were coming to oppose the state, and the kind of clashes that were happening that clearly showed this fracture that has happened over this agrarian to the urban transition of this community, right? And not everybody has become urban in the way that Delhi Jats have. So there is a whole story of, so this is very, how to put it? This is a very, almost like a film-like story of what happens to two brothers in a way, right? In the 1960s and 70s, it's the rural Jats who are doing well, who have all the land, who are getting all these subsidies and are doing well, right? And it's the Delhi Jats who don't have agrarian land and they're sitting with poor quality soil and they're not necessarily being able to do much with agriculture, who are poorer cousins. And by 1990s, by 2000s, those fortunes flipped, right? It's the rise of the real estate, the urban jats of Delhi, they start doing much better. Whereas with the decline of the Green Revolution, the UP jats and the Chaudhry Charan Singh, that kind of coterie begins to do far worse, and we see that in the works of Jeffries and elsewhere as to how that there is a almost an obverse relationship, and that shows in Delhi's politics. In the last chapter, when I talk about Delhi's electoral politics, these fractures have always been sort of quite alive. So, but like I said, when I realized all of this, when I put these pieces together, the work had advanced quite a bit, and there were limits that were already placed, and I could not have asked the question. So I couldn't even talk about how in Delhi's villages there has been a shift from being Congress loyalists, right? They were deep loyalists of Congress, to then this sudden overnight shift to being deep BJP supporters. So how does that happen? So even that story wouldn't have made sense unless I put the regional question, but all of those were then, I guess, some battles you win, some battles you lose, and you just make your peace with it. That's where I was.
Some you fight the next time.
Some I fight the next time. So had I, gotten a chance to, in fact, even reframe the work, I would have probably taken the regional scale, and which is why I'm saying I'm inspired by anthropology and history. But I think the one discipline that is not as appreciated in social sciences is geography, and I think geography is fundamental to how we do research, and at some level I think take that discipline a little more seriously. So the regional framing of it would have explained the questions that you are asking. Right, the 1963 circular plan, again, why is it that they couldn't intervene? They just entirely stopped to intervene after 1963. My guess is that they just did not have the bandwidth, right? They were caught up with this whole mega urban Delhi master plan, how to sort of make Delhi into NCR and NCR into Delhi and all kinds of things. They did not have the time, the mind space to even think about these villages and what is going to be their fortune, and they just left it at that. This is my guess, right? As in, no document would ever say this, right? No document would ever sort of acknowledge this to have happened. They're only saying that we will let them be villages, because to some extent I don't think the bureaucrats and the technocrats had a foresight to what is going to happen to them, right? Some of them are being romanticized, saying they will continue to supply milk to the city. They will continue to be like these great recreational spaces where city people can go and spend a weekend, right? Those kinds of some fray comments are coming in saying why should we retain villages into the city? But there is no deep engagement with the question of the presence of the city and what is going to happen to them when you're taking away the land. Are they really going to be villages anymore? That engagement, that serious engagement is not there. The only serious engagement, and I think this is coming from another colleague of ours, Aprajita Sarkar, who's also a product of CPS, where she's talking about the only time the villages become important is when it comes to population control. So her work is on population and the coming up of DDA and how do you come up with flats. So this is when they get very invested in Delhi villages where they're trying to put up these Nazbandi Kendra here, there, in Najafgarh, and this different kinds of spaces. And that's when the village space becomes important through the lens of public health and population control. Yeah. So then there is also that bigger story to tell, which again I don't think I would be the best person to do it. The urban-rural fractions, these communities, when do these communities sort of work together, when do they not work together? That's a tough one, right? As in, it's a hard one to sort of put into, again, neat boxes and say, okay, this is when they work and this is when they don't work. But one, what I could say is that it's in some senses also again deeply tied to the question of political economy. Rent requires them to operate collectively, right? Rent does not allow the presence of some glorified individual actor like capital does, right? We celebrate an Elon Musk, we celebrate, say, a Narayan Murthy or someone, right? But rent would require everyone to be together, to be a collective. Otherwise, the power of rent is lost, right? So if that's the case, so that's when I think when it comes to the question of collective property ownership, that's when they operate together. But in other moments, you see fractures, you see family disputes, you see property disputes. There is all of that, right? So I think there is definitely an impulse of being an individualist, and but there is also this thing of being a collective actor at the same time, and there are deep fractures here. I have 10 minutes?
8 minutes.
8 minutes, okay. Wow, okay. Rajoshi, again, partition of the sensible, absolutely on point. And I think that partition of sensible operates at a theoretical level as well, where what do we see in terms of the theoretical lens is also then, and what do we not see, then also becomes a question of the partition of the sensible. I'm just going a little faster. I thought I had more time.
Skip my bits and
No, I won't skip, as in these are good and important questions. About methods, I would really urge you that to consider that methods don't belong to anyone, right? Nobody has a monopoly over methods. Methods belong to everyone. Feel free to borrow methods from whichever discipline you feel like. Just see what your field demands and what kind of questions you're interested in asking and what kind of methods would work best for it. So you should not be tied to any particular kind of disciplinary sense of methods. So I don't think methods belong to disciplines. Questions do, right? So the questions you ask will be different, right? Because as a political scientist, as a sociologist, we will ask different questions of the same field, and that's okay. And that's, I think, where somewhere our disciplinary training comes into being, which is, I think, where we are sort of productive, but be as non-committal to methods, to just borrow as freely as possible. And do remember that our methods and our analysis are not independent. Our analysis, the analysis that we'll end up doing, depends a great deal on the methods we pick, right? So be aware of that relationship. So if there's a particular kind of analysis you do, then you pick particular kinds of methods. Chiroshri, again, thank you for those questions. Those are precisely the questions that I have been sort of, in some sense, jostling with. But a lot of it I sort of kept out of the book because one of my commitments to myself was that I would keep this book as readable as possible. So I would let these debates not necessarily overpower the analysis that is coming through the field. And that's the choice I made, because I realized I cannot do both substantively together in the same piece of work. Since then, I've been working on a theoretical piece on rent, which hasn't gotten done, but I'll come back to you on that. So absolutely, I think different kinds of urban villages. I'll just go on. So yes, that's there, but then different kinds of urban villages do different things. But then they are all working from similar kinds of ownership patterns, and specific kinds of villages lend to specific kinds of enterprise. Munirka's enterprise is very different from Shapurjat's. It's very different from Mahipalpur's, right, which is all about hotels, as it's different from North Delhi's. But then there is a certain kind of cohesion irrespective, right? Urban and rural, I think that's been fairly sort of covered, that it's not a continuum, and there is a lot that is happening here. Wait, let me just. So thank you for again. So I'll just come to the major the theoretical questions that you raised, right? As to what about rent and capital and Utsa Patnaik's work, and I've also been reading EMS Nambudripad's interesting work on land reforms, and then how he thought of rent and landlords, and that's the sad part, right? I think rent just disappeared of the political economy discourse at a particular time, and then other concepts sort of took over, and then we're now seeing a certain kind of resurgence of rent, but there's this huge gap to fill between these moments where we don't necessarily know. So rent used to be that dominant kind of category in the 50s and the 60s. It's no longer that. So I don't necessarily always know how to sort of bridge that gap, and probably I should come back to you for that. So rent and capital, it's not a binary. I agree, right? I think this is also something. I think it comes across as binary in my work, because I think I was so anxious about showing that rent is something and rent is not. It's not collapsible with capital, right? As in, so I think it comes across as I'm trying to say that rent and capital are two separate things entirely, and they're independent. I'm not saying that they're independent, but they operate together. There's a very deep relationship between the two. They're very good friends also, right? It's not like they work opposite each other, but at the same time there are fractions, and that is what the frictions here, and that's what I was trying to sort of highlight, that there is that's what's happening. How localized is the local, right? And how this local and global binary. And again, I think there's a way in which this particular kind of rent is not purely local, right? As in, this is a rent that feeds into finance capital very, very easily, right? In many, many ways. As in, these are the lenders to different kinds of startups. These are the tenants to different kinds of. If you look at Shapurjat, the entire global garment industry, whatever fraction that exists in Shapurjat, is dependent on landlords for labor control, right? And for capital investment as well, not just for space. So they are deeply, deeply enmeshed in that entire production process. So they are not separate here. So at least in a place like Shapurjat, you see how deeply connected it is to the global economy. So it's not, again, a localized space. There's a way in which this rent directly feeds into global capital, but then this is still a specific kind of rent, which is not the Brett Christopher's rent, is not the Yanis Varoufakis kind of rent. And I'm still struggling with how best to make sense of this without saying it's particular or specific. This is only local, that's global. Totally on board with that. Do I have more time? I don't think I have.
I think you can read the rest.
Yeah, I think there's a lot, but I hope I will be able to answer.